This is Caro-Kann defense, an interesting opening weapon for black against the white's first move pawn to e4. Frequently, white plays either knight to c3 or pawn to e5. And pawn to e5, the main move for black is bishop f5. Instead of that, I recommend that you play pawn to c5. So your opponents will often play pawn to c3, and now you just go knight to c6, putting pressure onto this white central pawn on d4 at this point or in the future, because in this case, first of all, you can immediately take back this white's pawn on e5, as you can play your pawn to e6, which would also open up the dark square bishop, and therefore very likely that they'll try to actually keep up that pawn on d4, and they'll play knight to f3. This enables your bishop to be developed to g4, you pin the knight. Here the most played move is bishop e2, you go pawn to e6, now let's say white castles, and you go knight to e7. Your idea is to focus a lot of your forces against that white's pawn on d4. If white plays bishop e3 trying to protect it, you go knight to f5. Now the knight from f5 is hitting this pawn on d4 once again. Most of the white players play the move pawn to h3. So here you take on f3. In this particular case, this exchange rather favors black. And now you play queen to b6. The queen also puts one more attack to this pawn on c5. It's just really critical and something that white cannot handle anymore. And if they take on c5, these pawns become weak. Your queen from b6 not only puts pressure along this diagonal, but it also hits the pawn on b2. And now you can just grab it and also attack the rook. It is to develop their knight. Now you can grab the bishop on e3 to further break the white's pawn structure. And you're going to collect them one after another. For example, queen takes c3. If they protect that pawn, then bishop takes c5. And now this pawn is weak, this pawn can be captured, and then you castle, you grab all these pawns, and you're just getting a winning position. Now let me show you another line which is possible in this variation of the Caro-Kann defense. The move pawn to c5. White is just take on c5 right away. Black goes knight to c6, putting pressure on this pawn, so white protects it. Then once again you go bishop g4, white goes bishop e2, and now you play pawn to e6. And let's say they go bishop f4. In this case, you take back the pawn on c5, let's say white castles, you switch your attack against the pawn on e5. You can bring your knight out to e7 and g6, and from there it'll attack the bishop as well as the pawn. But in this case, you may opt for a more direct approach and just right away grab the pawn. So you take first the knight and then you go bishop d4. The bishop attacks this pawn on e5 together with the knight, but also it attacks the pawn on b2. Increase the pressure onto this pawn on e5 by playing queen to c7, so it can attack the pawn, or your knight can go out and attack the pawn from here. In this case, let's say white goes into the line which we analyzed previously. They take the pawn, here we go knight to c6, they play knight f3, bishop g4, and just play some neutral moves such as pawn to c3. I can grab this pawn, but that was a trap set by white earlier, because white has a really strong response, knight takes e5. Temporarily sacrificing their queen, but on the next move they go bishop b5 check, so you have to give your queen away. And now on the next move, while grab your bishop on d1, so that is one of the traps that you gotta be aware of. Of course, there is nothing dangerous in white playing pawn to c3, it's just that you don't need to get trapped like that. Instead, you just play pawn to e6. You opened up your dark square bishop. In this case, white has one more trap that you need to know. White may play bishop e3, pretending like they overlooked your threat of knight takes e5. But you still should not take this poisoned pawn right now, because in this case, white has the move queen to a4, so on the next move, they're ready to grab your knight. If you cover the king by the knight, then white would grab the bishop right here on g4, which is no longer defending. But what is the right move? One of the interesting lines is to play pawn to a6 to prevent any kind of problems along this diagonal, and after that you are truly ready to grab that pawn on e5 on the next move. The only thing white can possibly do to hold that pawn is to play bishop d4. You first of all eliminate this defender, and then you play pawn to b6, threatening to just grab it, so white has to take. Now you take that bishop on d4, and finally you take with the queen the pawn on b6. Now white has a whole lot of these weaknesses. The only way to possibly protect both the pawns is to play queen c3, but it fails due to bishop b4, in this case winning the queen thanks to this pin. What you can do in case white goes knight c3, another way, not pawn to e5 but knight to c3. The simplest way that you can go for is to take there and play knight to f6, because after the exchange you take with a pawn, Let's say white plays anything, you go bishop d6, then you castle. After that, you develop your bishop to g4. On the next move, you play knight to d7, you'll probably place your rook to e8,